I used to move enough firepower to level city blocks. Now I can't sleep unless my forehead touches the ground 5 times a day. The same hands that counted blood money now fold in prayer, and the silence I once bought with fear, I now find in submission. 15 years. That's how long I fed the machine. Not drugs, not women, not gambling. Death. Pure, efficient, untraceable death. I was the bridge between manufacturers and the streets, between boardrooms and body bags. They called me the ghost because you never saw me coming, and by the time you realized what I'd sold you, I was already gone. My operation wasn't some back-alley gun show. This was corporate, clean. I had distributors in 12 states, suppliers in 4 countries, and enough political protection to sleep soundly. Or so I thought. The money came in waves, 50,000 here, 200,000 there. By year 3, I was clearing 8 figures annually. Cash that never touched a bank, never left a trail, never asked questions. I had accountants who specialized in creative bookkeeping, lawyers who knew which questions not to ask, and politicians who understood that campaign contributions bought more than just access. The system was perfect, efficient, and completely insulated from consequences. Every transaction was sanitized through multiple layers of legitimate businesses, gun stores, security companies, private military contractors. On paper, I didn't exist. In reality, I was untouchable. I lived in a fortress disguised as a suburban mansion. Steel-reinforced walls, bulletproof glass, panic rooms stocked like military bunkers. My neighbors thought I was in tech. Import-export, I'd say when pressed. Which wasn't technically a lie. I imported death and exported chaos, and business was always booming. The first time I held a Kalashnikov, I was 19. I remember the weight. Not just the physical weight, though that was real enough. 7.5 pounds of steel and wood that could end 30 lives without reloading. But the other weight, the weight of knowing that this thing in my hands would likely kill someone I'd never meet, in a place I'd never see, for reasons I'd never understand. That weight settled into my chest and never left. But the money made it easier to carry. The corruption didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, like water wearing away stone. Each transaction made the next one easier. Each profit margin justified pushing the boundaries a little further. What started as handguns to local dealers evolved into military-grade hardware to international buyers. I told myself I was just adapting to market demand, but the truth was simpler and darker. I was becoming addicted to the power that came with controlling life and death from a distance. The rush of knowing that a single phone call from me could arm a revolution or supply a massacre. It was intoxicating in a way that money alone never could be. My clients never came to me directly. I had layers, buffers, cutouts who handled the face-to-face transactions while I orchestrated from the shadows. A text message here, an encrypted email there, and suddenly another shipment would disappear into the underground. AR-15s to Chicago, Glocks to Detroit. Military-grade hardware to places where military-grade hardware wasn't supposed to exist. I knew my customers only as numbers in encrypted databases. Client 247 needed 50 assault rifles. Client 891 wanted handguns with untraceable serial numbers. Client 1205 required military surplus that officially didn't exist. They weren't people to me. They were revenue streams, profit margins, market opportunities. This detachment was deliberate and necessary. The moment you start seeing your clients as human beings with human motivations, you start asking questions that are bad for business. I told myself I was just a businessman. Supply and demand, market forces. If I didn't do it, someone else would. The weapons were going to move anyway, so why shouldn't I profit? These were the lies I fed myself during the day. At night, alone in my reinforced bedroom, the weight would settle heavier. The paranoia started small. Checking locks twice, varying my routes, sleeping with a loaded pistol under my pillow. But paranoia in my line of work isn't paranoia. It's survival instinct. And my instincts were screaming. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every phone call could be the last one I'd ever take. I started seeing federal agents in coffee shops, rival dealers in parking lots, potential assassins in every crowd. The weight wasn't just emotional anymore, it was physical. My chest felt compressed, like invisible hands were squeezing the life out of me one breath at a time. Food lost its taste. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Even in my fortress, surrounded by armed security, I felt exposed and vulnerable. By year 7, I trusted no one completely. Not my distributors, not my suppliers, not even my own security team. Everyone was a potential threat, a possible informant, a walking liability. I had contingency plans for my contingency plans, safe houses in 3 countries, multiple identities, enough cash buried in various locations to start over anywhere on Earth. But you can't bury the weight. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing shipping manifests in my office when my phone buzzed. A news alert. School shooting in Pennsylvania. 14 dead, including the gunman. My coffee went cold as I read the details. 3 AR-15 rifles, modified for maximum lethality. Serial numbers filed off, but the make and model were unmistakable. I'd moved 50 of those exact weapons through Pennsylvania distributors 6 months earlier. The modifications matched specifications I'd personally approved: extended magazines, enhanced triggers, tactical accessories designed to maximize casualties in minimum time. This wasn't coincidence. This was my signature written in blood across a school hallway. I told myself it was coincidence. Those weapons could have come from anywhere. Dozens of suppliers moved that particular model, but the weight in my chest grew heavier, and for the first time in years, my hands shook as I deleted the news alert. 2 months later, another shooting, this time in Texas, a nightclub, 22 dead. The weapons were traced to a batch I'd personally overseen. Not coincidence, not anymore. The math was becoming undeniable. My weapons weren't just killing criminals and gang members. They were killing innocents, teenagers, families, people whose only crime was being in the wrong place when someone with my product decided to become a monster. I found myself researching the victims online, scrolling through social media profiles of people I'd never met, but whose deaths I'd enabled. A college student studying to be a teacher, a father celebrating his daughter's birthday, a bartender working her way through nursing school. Each face was a weight added to my chest, a name written in my conscience with permanent ink. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake calculating how many people might be dead because of weapons I'd moved. The numbers grew in the darkness. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Faceless victims of transactions I'd approved, shipments I'd authorized, profits I'd collected. I started drinking heavily. Vodka, mostly, because it was clear and left less evidence on my breath during business meetings. But alcohol just made the weight heavier, the guilt more vivid. The faces of news anchors announcing death tolls became faces in my dreams, always asking the same question: why did you give them the tools? The money kept coming. Business was better than ever, actually. Mass shootings drove demand through the roof. Every tragedy was a marketing opportunity, every headline a sales pitch. The more people died, the more people wanted to buy. The cycle was perfect, profitable, and completely insane. But I was trapped in it. The organization I'd built had grown beyond my control. Stopping wasn't just a matter of walking away. Too many people depended on the cash flow. Too many dangerous people who wouldn't understand retirement. In my world, you only left the business one way, and it wasn't voluntary. The beginning of the end came on a Thursday in October. I was eating breakfast in my kitchen, scrolling through emails on my encrypted phone, when the news broke. Another school shooting, this time in Colorado. The footage was everywhere. Ambulances lined up like a convoy, parents screaming in parking lots, children running with their hands over their heads. 17 dead, all under the age of 16. But this time was different. This time, the shooter had live-streamed the attack, and this time, the weapons were clearly visible on camera. 3 handguns and an assault rifle, all from a batch I'd personally approved for Colorado distribution just 8 weeks earlier. I knew because I still had the manifests in my safe. The serial number sequence was burned into my memory. I watched a child die on live television with a weapon I had sold. Not just enabled, Not just facilitated, sold, with full knowledge of what it was designed to do and where it would likely end up. The footage kept playing on news channels, and I couldn't stop watching, couldn't look away from the direct line between my decisions and those broken bodies in school hallways. This was my handiwork displayed in high definition for the world to see. The weight in my chest exploded outward, crushing my ribs, stopping my breath. I stumbled to my bathroom and vomited until my stomach was empty, then kept vomiting bile and blood. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize the man staring back. Gray skin, hollow eyes, the face of someone who had fed on death for so long that death was starting to feed on him. That night, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I went to my basement, not the finished basement where I entertained clients, the real basement, the sub-basement that only I knew about, where I stored the inventory that was too hot to keep in warehouses, where I kept the weapons that were too dangerous to trust to anyone else. Crates lined the walls, military surplus, factory overstock, custom modifications, enough firepower to outfit a small army. I'd built an empire selling death, and this was my treasure room, my legacy. Row after row of tools designed for one purpose: ending human life as efficiently as possible. I sat down in the middle of it all, surrounded by the instruments of my trade, the source of my wealth, the foundation of my power, and for the first time since I was 19 years old, I felt completely powerless. The silence was absolute. No phones ringing, no texts buzzing, no demands from distributors or suppliers. Just me and the weapons and the weight of what I'd done, what I'd become, what I'd enabled. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. Long enough for the metal around me to grow cold. Long enough for the darkness to feel comfortable. Long enough to understand that I was already dead inside, and had been for years. Then I heard it. At first I thought it was coming from outside, a song maybe, or music from a neighbor's house. But the sound was coming from directly above me, from my phone, which I'd left on the workbench near the entrance. The screen was glowing, and an app I didn't recognize was playing what sounded like singing? Chanting? The melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard, ancient and mournful, yet somehow filled with hope. It seemed to echo off the concrete walls, mixing with the metallic smell of weapons and the musty dampness of underground air. I climbed the stairs and picked up the phone. Someone had sent me a link, a mosque app. The call to prayer was echoing through my basement, mixing with the silence and the smell of gun oil and the weight of everything I'd done. Each word seemed to cut through the darkness like a blade of light, reaching places inside me that I'd thought were dead forever. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. It was the sound of surrender, of admitting that you were small and lost and broken, of crying out to something bigger than your own darkness. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. I'd never heard anything like it. Not in church, where the words felt empty and rehearsed. Not in the silence of my reinforced bedroom, where only my own thoughts echoed back. This was different. This was someone calling out to God like God was actually listening. The call ended, but I kept standing there holding the phone. Something had shifted in my chest. The weight was still there, but it felt different, like it was breaking apart, like the pieces were falling away instead of pressing deeper. I looked around my basement, at the crates of weapons, at the instruments of death that had made me wealthy and powerful and completely hollow. And for the first time in 15 years, I saw them for what they really were. Not business inventory, not profitable merchandise, not tools of the trade. They were pieces of hell that I'd collected and polished and sold to the world. That's when I broke. Not physically, not mentally, spiritually. The part of me that had justified 15 years of feeding violence collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. I fell to my knees among the weapons crates, and the sound that came out of me wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite screaming. It was the sound of a soul realizing it was dying. The sound of 15 years of buried guilt erupting all at once. Every victim I'd never seen, every family I'd destroyed, every life cut short by instruments I'd put into circulation. They all came flooding back in a wave of anguish that threatened to drown me. I'd spent so long building walls around my conscience that when they finally crumbled, the debris nearly buried me alive. This wasn't just guilt. This was the complete annihilation of every lie I'd told myself to sleep at night. I'd seen the victims' faces earlier that day. Children, teenagers with whole lives ahead of them, cut down by weapons I'd put in circulation. Their deaths weren't accidents or unfortunate side effects of business. They were the inevitable result of what I'd chosen to do with my life. I wasn't just an arms dealer. I was a mass murderer who'd never pulled a trigger. The realization was devastating and complete. I pressed my forehead to the concrete floor of my basement and begged, not to my customers or my suppliers or my bank accounts, to Allah. I didn't know why I used that name instead of God. I barely knew what it meant, but it was the name I'd heard in the call to prayer, and it felt like the only name that might listen to someone like me. Allah, forgive me. Allah, I'm sorry. Allah, I don't know how to fix what I've broken. I stayed on that basement floor for 3 hours, face pressed to the cold concrete, surrounded by instruments of death, begging a God I barely understood to show me how to become something other than what I was. The weight in my chest was breaking apart, piece by piece, and each piece that fell away made room for something else, something that felt like hope, though I wasn't sure I deserved it. When I finally stood up, everything looked different. The weapons crates weren't inventory anymore. They were evidence of 15 years of feeding violence and terror and death to a world that already had too much of all three. Evidence that I'd built an empire on the systematic destruction of human life. But they were also something else. They were an opportunity. Over the next 6 months, I dismantled everything. Not quickly, because quick would have meant bodies in the street and federal investigations. Slowly, carefully, methodically. I canceled contracts, dissolved partnerships, liquidated inventory through legitimate channels where possible, and destroyed it where it wasn't. The money went into accounts I'd never touch again, set aside for victims' families I'd probably never be able to identify. Every conversation was a negotiation with dangerous people who didn't understand retirement. Every canceled shipment was a potential death sentence if handled wrong. I had to convince suppliers that I was scaling back, not shutting down. Had to reassure distributors that this was temporary market adjustment, not permanent exit. The lies came easier than the truth would have. Telling them I'd found Islam and wanted to stop selling death would have been suicide. So I lied, manipulated, and slowly bled the operation to death over 6 months of careful strangulation. The hardest part wasn't giving up the wealth or the power or the respect that came with being untouchable. The hardest part was learning to live with the weight of what I'd done, even after I'd stopped doing it, even after I'd found Islam and started praying and reading the Quran and trying to understand how Allah could forgive someone like me. That weight is still there. It always will be. But now it sits differently in my chest. Not like a crushing burden, but like a responsibility, a reminder, a compass pointing toward something better than what I used to be. I pray 5 times a day now, always starting the same way, with my forehead on the ground and my hands empty of everything except hope. The same position I first found on the concrete floor of my basement, surrounded by the tools of my former trade, crying out to a God whose name I barely knew. Each prayer is a conversation with the weight I carry, not trying to make it disappear, but learning to carry it with purpose instead of shame. The morning prayer reminds me that every day is a chance to build instead of destroy. The evening prayer helps me account for how I used that chance. Between those moments, I try to live like someone who remembers what it felt like to be completely lost and completely found in the same breath. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Every morning when I make wudu, I look at my hands in the running water and remember what they used to do. count blood money, sign death contracts, shake hands with monsters. Now they wash before prayer and turn pages in the Quran and reach out to other people who've carried weight like mine and found a way to put it down. If you're still listening to this, you probably know why I'm telling you this story. Maybe you're carrying your own weight. Maybe you've built your own empire on someone else's pain. Maybe you've convinced yourself that the damage you're doing is just business, just survival, just the way the world works. I'm not going to tell you to change your life. I'm not going to promise that Islam will solve all your problems or make the weight disappear completely. What I can tell you is this: that basement floor was the first honest prayer I'd ever prayed, and it saved what was left of my soul. The call to prayer still plays on my phone 5 times a day, and every time I hear it, I remember that no matter how far into the darkness you've gone, there's always a voice calling you back to the light. You just have to be broken enough to listen. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. The same God who heard me crying on a concrete floor surrounded by instruments of death can hear you wherever you are, carrying whatever weight you're carrying. All you have to do is put your forehead down and mean it. That's all it takes. And that's everything.